What if everything you've learned about God is incomplete? What if behind the traditions you know, there's a truth hidden for millennia, stifled by empires, silenced by dominant religions, and carefully erased from history? Imagine for a moment that before Yahweh, the God presented in the Bible, other deities already existed, dark gods, worshipped by ancient civilizations, powerful, spiritual, cosmic. Why does no one talk about them? Why don't sacred books openly mention these divine figures who reigned in ancient cultures with wisdom, justice, and authority? This video is unlike any other. It's a portal, a key that unlocks a door that has been locked for thousands of years. What you're about to see may forever change your perception of faith, spirituality, and above all, your own identity. Because perhaps what was called paganism in the past was actually a profound spiritual connection, and an African one. Perhaps the gods who were demonized or erased were, in fact, deities of light, wisdom, and power. Could they be the true creators of spiritual traditions that were later rewritten under the name of a single god? You are about to enter forbidden territory, a territory that disturbs theologians, historians, and religious institutions. We are going to talk about gods who were worshipped long before Moses heard a voice in the desert. Gods like Amun-Ra, Olodumare, Ptah, Enki, and other names that carry with them the power of ancient civilizations from Africa, Mesopotamia, and the East. Gods who created myths, laws, spiritual principles, and worldviews that even influenced the emergence of Yahweh. But this part of history has been torn away, distorted, covered by a veil of silence and fear. The question is, why did they hide this? Why was this religion silenced? The answer is simple: power. To control the spiritual narrative of a people is to control their soul. And the older and more powerful this faith was, the more dangerous it became for the empires that arose afterward. The revelation of these truths not only confronts the official versions of the scriptures, but also rekindles a forgotten flame, that of the black spiritual legacy, buried but never destroyed. In this video, you will learn who these black gods were, where and how they were worshipped, what symbols and rituals they used, how they were incorporated or combated by religions that emerged later, and why there is still so much fear of talking about them today. We will reveal the hidden connections between African traditions and the foundations of Christianity. We will bring to light the forbidden texts that mention forgotten entities, and more. You will see how images of black deities have been transformed over time to fit the dominant Eurocentric narrative. All of this will be explored throughout 10 revealing parts, which will take you from the origins of African spirituality to the behind the scenes of the Bible, passing through spiritual wars, historical erasures, hidden syncretisms, and finally a profound reflection on who God really is, and what is the role of black ancestry in this ancient mystery. There's no going back now. The question has already been asked. Now it's time to discover what was hidden, and in the next moment of this journey, we will look at the beginning of it all. Who were the first black gods, and why were their names erased from history? If this topic has already begun to challenge your certainties, it's because you feel, deep down, that there's something bigger waiting to be discovered. And now I want to know, had you heard about the existence of these dark gods before Yahweh? Which part of this revelation has impacted you the most so far? Leave a comment below telling me what this evokes in you. Your doubt, your perspective, or even your resistance. This space is ours. It's for exchange. It's for deep reflection. If this content resonates with you, if it made you think, if it raised questions no one has ever asked you before, then don't leave without giving it a like. This shows YouTube that this type of video needs to reach more people. And of course, subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell, because this journey is only beginning. In the next chapters, the truth will become even clearer and stronger. You won't want to miss what comes next. Even before any line of scripture was written, even before Moses heard a voice echoing from the midst of a burning bush, ancient peoples were already turning to the heavens in search of answers. They looked at the stars, at the cycles of nature, at the pulse of life, and understood that there was something beyond. And this something beyond was not a distant mystery, but a living, present, powerful, and, for many, black presence. Yes, ancestral African spirituality revered the divine long before the name Yahweh was known. And at this point in our journey, we will delve deeply into this forgotten universe, a universe where Olodumare, Amun-Ra, and other black gods were central to the faith of ancient civilizations. While the Western world has become accustomed to a linear religious narrative centered on only one god revealed to a single people, Africa already harbored a complex, incredibly rich, and profoundly spiritual pantheon. And here, we are not talking about paganism in the pejorative sense imposed by dominant religions, but about an ancestral wisdom that understood the divine in its totality, in its multiple manifestations, in its archetypes and energies. It was a spirituality that saw God on earth, in the sky, in the waters, in the human body, in the relationships between people, and in time itself. Olodumare, for example, is a central deity in the Yoruba worldview. He is not just one god among others, but the supreme principle, creator of heaven and earth, origin of all that exists. And what is most impressive is realizing that this concept already existed many centuries before any Mosaic account, before the Torah, before the tablets of the law. Olodumare was worshipped with reverence, not as a distant being, but as a nearby force, manifesting itself through other orishas, deities that represent aspects of the Creator himself, such as justice, wisdom, fertility, transformation, and balance. This profoundly spiritual and integrated vision was lived, celebrated, and taught among the peoples of West Africa, and not only on the continent. Its influence reached various parts of the ancient world through trade and cultural routes. In Black Egypt, Amun-Ra was more than a solar deity. He was the invisible principle manifesting itself in visible light. Amun, the hidden one, united with Ra, the visible one, created the idea of a god who is simultaneously invisible and present in all things. The Egyptians saw no contradiction in this. On the contrary, this union of the spiritual and the physical, of heaven and earth, of the invisible and the manifest, was the heart of Egyptian spirituality. Now, observe carefully. Doesn't this idea of an invisible God who governs everything and manifests himself through his creation seem familiar? The structure of later monotheism, centered on Yahweh, bears marks, echoes, and deep traces of this Egyptian conception that was already celebrated millennia before. These black gods were not merely objects of worship. They were living symbols of identity, wisdom, justice, prosperity, and connection to the universe. And most powerfully, they were recognized as part of humanity's own origins. The Nubian people, for example, one of the oldest civilizations in Africa, already worshipped divine figures with black human features. In many archaeological representations found, the features, clothing, symbols, and even narratives refer to entities that guided, protected, and taught the people from the most remote times. Ethiopia, another sacred cradle of African spirituality, also preserved for centuries cults to deities predating the biblical Yahweh. And more than that, many scholars believe that some biblical references were inspired by or adapted from Ethiopian spiritual elements. For example, the very idea of a chosen people, of a divine covenant, of a God who walks with his people, was already known among Ethiopian and Nubian priests. They spoke of entities that guided kings, gave visions to prophets, and demanded justice as the foundation of community life. Records indicate that these cultures possessed an organized religious structure, with temples, priests, spiritual codes, and even sacred texts, many of which have been lost or hidden over the centuries. This leads us to an important reflection. Was the erasure of these black gods merely accidental, or was it an intentional movement driven by forces that needed to centralize religious power in just one figure, one nation, one lineage? It's not difficult to see that, over time, these traditions were systematically erased or demonized. Not because they were weak, but precisely because they were too powerful to coexist with the new religions that were emerging and needed to assert themselves as the only ones. History shows that monotheism, in its geopolitical construction, often silenced ancient spiritual voices that did not fit into its centralized model. And within this process, black spirituality, vibrant, multifaceted, ancestral, was pushed to the sidelines of history. But it did not disappear. It persisted in chants, in rituals preserved in secret, in oral traditions, in symbols hidden in dances and ceremonies. It even persisted in the Bible, in fragments, names, and figures that escaped religious censorship. The presence of these gods, these black deities, can still be perceived by those with attentive eyes and open hearts. And perhaps the most impactful thing of all is understanding that the spiritual foundation of humanity is deeply connected to the African continent, to its gods, its stories, and its people. Do you realize the impact of this? Recognizing that before Yahweh there was a structured, vibrant, and black faith is to acknowledge that spirituality doesn't have a color defined by domination, but has deep roots embedded in the history of the peoples who came before any conquest, colonization, or reinterpretation. This doesn't negate other faiths. It merely reveals that there was a silenced anteriority. And it is precisely this revelation that is unsettling, because it shakes the foundations of everything that has been taught as unique, as right, as absolute. Now I want to know, were you already familiar with deities like Olodumare or Amon-Ra? Had you heard about the spirituality of Nubia or Ethiopia before the Bible? Which part of this hidden truth has touched you the most so far? Comment below. The truth needs to be revealed. If you feel something new awakening within you, and if you're still here, it's because this knowledge is speaking to you. As we advance on this journey of profound and challenging discoveries, it's impossible to ignore the complexity of the religious landscape in which the name of Yahweh begins to appear. Contrary to what many imagine, the emergence of this God, now considered central to monotheistic religions, did not happen in a spiritual vacuum. Yahweh emerged amidst a diversity of cults, rituals, deities, and traditions that already dominated the imagination of ancient peoples. The world before the emergence of the God of Israel was profoundly polytheistic, a true mosaic of beliefs, where each people, each city, and even each family clan maintained relationships with different gods, celestial entities, and ancestral spirits. And it is in this vibrant, chaotic, and sacred setting that we will now delve deeper. Imagine a time when names like El, Baal, Asherah, Moloch, Dagon, and many others dominated worship in the lands of the Middle East, especially in the regions of ancient Canaan, Ugarit, Mesopotamia, and even around Egypt and Nubia. Each of these deities had its own functions, attributes, and mythologies. El, for example, was considered the father of the gods by the Canaanites. Baal was the god of storms and fertility. Asherah was the mother goddess, El's consort, frequently linked to sacred trees and fertility rituals. And these were not just names in isolated mythologies, they were actively worshipped by entire communities, with temples, priests, festivals, and rites that marked people's daily lives. In this same context, the ancient Hebrews, before being shaped by rigid monotheism, were immersed in these influences. They were not an isolated people, spiritually pure or immune to neighboring beliefs. They were part of a broader Semitic culture that interacted, mixed, and often adopted religious aspects from other peoples. Yahweh, at this point in history, emerges as just one more deity among many, perhaps initially associated with a specific clan or tribe, which saw in him a warrior force, a god of the mountains, or a guiding presence in the midst of battles. It is very likely that the name Yahweh circulated among the Midianite, Edomite, and other desert nomad peoples before being fully incorporated into the religious structure of Israel. The archaeological texts found in the ancient city of Ugarit, for example, reveal a rich and elaborate theology, with gods who possessed hierarchies and functions similar to those that would later be attributed to Yahweh. In many of these inscriptions, we see El as the supreme god, the one who presides over the council of the gods, the creator of heaven and earth. Baal, his son, is the warrior, the protector of the harvests, the one who fights against the forces of chaos. The very structure of these narratives shows us that the concept of a supreme god and his spiritual emissaries was not exclusive to the Hebrew people. On the contrary, it was part of an ancient and shared collective imagination. And here's something even more striking. In many of these texts, we find impressive similarities to biblical passages. For example, the idea of God riding on the clouds, facing the raging sea, calming the storm, or even being described as a mighty warrior leading his celestial armies. All these images appear in both Hebrew scriptures and Canaanite mythologies. What does this suggest? That Yahweh, upon emerging, inherited many of these symbols and attributes that had already been circulating for centuries, being reinterpreted, adapted, and shaped over time until becoming the central figure of monotheism. Another point that many are unaware of is that, in the earliest biblical records, Yahweh coexisted with other gods. That's right. There are texts in the Old Testament that acknowledge the existence of other deities, even if these passages were later softened or recontextualized. In Deuteronomy 32:8-9, for example, in its earliest form, we find the idea that the Most High divided the nations among the sons of the gods, and that Yahweh received Israel as his portion. This suggests that, at that time, Yahweh was one among many, a divine entity with a specific function within a larger structure of deities. Later, with the religious reforms promoted by leaders like King Josiah, we see a clear attempt to centralize worship solely on Yahweh, eliminating any mention or worship of other gods. Even so, vestiges of this original polytheism remain scattered throughout the biblical text. We find references to Asherah being worshipped in the temple, to sacrifices made to Molech, to lamentations directed at Tammuz, and even to songs for the Queen of Heaven. All this shows that the people of Israel, for much of their history, were not monotheistic in the strict sense, but rather practiced a form of monolatry. That is, they primarily worshipped Yahweh, but recognized the existence of other gods. Now, let's reflect together. Why was this information left out? Why was this more complex, more human, more real story replaced by a single, linear, and closed narrative? Because by transforming Yahweh into the only true God, excluding all others as false, spiritual, political, and social power, came into the hands of those who controlled this new theology. Monotheism, in this context, emerges not only as a belief, but as a strategy for unification and domination. And in this process, the spiritual voices that came from Africa, from black peoples and their deities, were silenced, erased, or demonized. What is most surprising is that, even with all these efforts, we are still able to trace the spiritual paths that intersected before religious domination. The connection with the black gods that preceded Yahweh remains alive in fragments, in texts that escaped censorship, in myths preserved in parallel cultures, and in archaeology that insists on reminding us that the history of the divine is neither linear nor European. It is multiple, it is hybrid, it is ancestral. And here you are, following this revelation with open eyes and a restless mind. Have you imagined what this means for your spiritual journey? Have you stopped to think that the God you were taught about may have emerged as part of a larger whole, and that perhaps, just perhaps, the faith you carry in your heart has deeper, older, and much darker roots than you imagined? Tell me in the comments, did you already know that Yahweh emerged in a scenario full of other gods? That he was just one name among many? Comment like this: I want the whole truth. If this new perspective is making you rethink everything. At this point in the journey, many questions have already begun to boil in the minds of those who are here with open souls to listen to what has been suppressed for so long. And when we look more closely at one of the best known and most revered narratives of all, the story of the Exodus, we realize that it is not alone. There are other stories, earlier and parallel, that echo elements very similar to what was told in the Bible. But these stories come from Africa, from black spiritual traditions, and have been systematically silenced over the centuries. The God of the Exodus, the one who speaks to Moses, who parts the sea, who liberates a people from slavery, may not be a new figure, but rather the representation of a spiritual force already known and worshipped long before the Hebrews left Egypt. And no, this does not diminish the impact of the biblical account. Quite the contrary, it broadens our understanding of the magnitude of the sacred and invites us to see that spirituality is a network of connections far older than organized religions have allowed us to recognize. Before Moses, there were already black spiritual leaders who guided their people with divine authority, who listened to the voice of the sacred, who performed feats considered miraculous, and who carried a direct link with powerful spiritual entities, often represented as solar, creator, and just deities. In the accounts preserved by Ethiopian, Nubian, and black Egyptian traditions, we find figures of priests, priest kings, and wise men who guided their people with a profound sense of divine purpose. They spoke in the name of the black gods, performed rituals reminiscent of the deeds attributed to Moses, and led collective liberations, not only physical but also spiritual. What many today call liberation from Egypt had already been recounted in other versions as the liberation of the human spirit from oppression, ignorance, and mental enslavement. And here begins a question that few dare to ask aloud. Was the God of the Exodus a reinvention of an earlier African deity? Could what the Bible presents as a unique manifestation of God actually be an adaptation of a power already known to African peoples? If we observe carefully, we will see that many of the attributes of the God who reveals himself to Moses, such as justice, fire, judgment, liberation, and revelation, are also characteristics of African deities like Amun-Ra and Olodumare. The presence of fire in the burning bush, for example, is a symbol that directly refers to the purification rituals and revelation of mysteries practiced in the temples of Black Egypt long before the formation of Israel as a nation. There are still those who question whether the character of Moses himself might not have been directly influenced by these African leaders. There are studies, ancient manuscripts, and oral traditions that speak of black prophets and spiritual guides who lived in Egypt and the land south of it, leaders who rose up against oppressive systems, who liberated entire peoples, and who had an intimate connection with ancestral divine forces. The most curious thing is that these accounts are rarely brought to light, as if there were an invisible pact of silence about the African origins of the faith that now dominates the Western world. And the truth is that this silence is not neutral. It is a choice made by power structures that could not admit that the spiritual basis of the Exodus narrative, one of the pillars of biblical monotheism, could have been inspired by black cultures. They could not accept that the God of the Exodus may not have been the beginning of a new faith, but rather the disguised continuation of an ancestral, black, and powerful faith. Because if this were acknowledged, the entire discourse of the spiritual supremacy of Eurocentric traditions would crumble. This is why so much is said about Moses, but almost nothing about the Ethiopian sages. Mount Sinai is exalted, but the sacred mountains of Africa, where deities had already appeared to their priests centuries before, are ignored. This is why the Exodus is canonized as the only valid account of divine liberation, while a rich history of previous liberations experienced by black peoples and their gods is rejected. But the echoes of this truth continue to resonate, stubbornly appearing in the details, in the subtext, in archaeological excavations, and in the oral traditions that have survived the test of time. And when we look with free eyes, without the lens of fear, we can perceive that the God who liberates, who guides, who protects, and who judges already existed in black cultures. He only received a new name, a new context, and was reintroduced to the world as something new. But the essence was already there. The idea of a God who walks with his people, who acts with power and justice, who is light and fire at the same time, was already part of African spirituality long before it was codified in Hebrew texts. This connection between the God of the Exodus and the dark gods of the past does not diminish faith. It enriches it, because it shows that the divine does not belong to just one people. It is revealed in many faces, in many names, in many cultures. And perhaps by recognizing this, we come closer to spiritual truth than we have ever been. The presence of the sacred did not begin with the Bible. It is ancient, alive, and universal. It speaks through the centuries, and today, it is speaking to you. Tell me in the comments, do you believe that the God of the Exodus may have African roots? That his spiritual history may have begun much earlier than you've been told? Comment below. The God of Africa lives, if you feel this truth needs to be told. And as we continue to excavate the layers of spiritual history that have been buried by time, or worse, deliberately hidden, we begin to see more clearly something disturbing, yet liberating. Many gods were simply erased from history. They didn't disappear because they were unimportant or meaningless. Quite the opposite. They were eliminated precisely because they made too much sense, because they carried wisdom, identity, power, and connection to the spiritual roots of peoples who, centuries later, would be dominated, colonized, and delegitimized. And this erasure was not an accident, but a meticulous project, a deep and continuous movement of replacement, repression, and demonization of everything that did not fit into the narrative constructed by hegemonic religions. Many of the Black, African, and Eastern gods, deities that guided entire civilizations, that had temples, priesthoods, symbols, oracles, festivals, and profound mythologies, were reconfigured as demons, evil spirits, or false idols. Their names, their stories, and even their qualities were reinterpreted under a judgmental gaze, and what was once considered sacred came to be seen as cursed. And this type of manipulation not only destroyed cultures but also disconnected millions of people from their ancestral spiritual heritage. Do you realize how serious this is? Imagine growing up being taught to hate the name of an entity that was actually revered by your ancestors as a source of healing, protection, and balance. Imagine carrying guilt for having within you spiritual memories that were demonized by systems that wanted to control faith, not liberate it. That is exactly what happened to a large part of the Black deities throughout history. They were systematically replaced, their attributes transferred to other figures, or simply banished from official narratives. Many of you may never have heard, for example, of Ptah, a Black Egyptian god linked to creation, the Word, and the manifestation of reality, or of Ma'at, the goddess of order, truth, and justice, whose presence was central to the spiritual judgments of the dead in Egypt. These names were swept from the sacred texts of the dominant religions, replaced by distant Western images with new names, shaped according to the political and theological interests of the institutions that took control of spirituality. This process of spiritual replacement went hand in hand with geopolitical colonization. When empires invaded and conquered new territories, they didn't just destroy the physical structures, they destroyed the local gods. Temples were torn down, sacred names forbidden, sacred symbols burned. In their place, new figures were imposed, saints who resembled the ancient gods, but with Latinized names, prophets who wielded similar powers, but now subservient to a single, centralized, divine narrative. This tactic was used in virtually every region that underwent colonization. In Africa, the Americas, Asia, and the Middle East. And where does the Bible fit into this? That's where the veil begins to tear, because the Bible, as we know it today, is not a complete collection of texts. There are books that were removed, suppressed, rejected. Many of these books, called apocryphal or pseudepigraphal, contained accounts of different spiritual entities, worldviews closer to African traditions, and messages that placed the divine far beyond the rigid structure imposed later. Books like the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Apocalypse of Abraham, and many others reveal a spiritual plurality that was stifled. In the Book of Enoch, for example, we find descriptions of fallen angels who teach hidden knowledge to humanity. But could these fallen angels actually be ancient deities considered too dangerous for the new religion? In some of these texts, we find names reminiscent of the dark gods of antiquity, but now presented as rebels, punished, banished. Is this or is this not a rewriting of sacred history? When you put all these pieces together, you begin to see a pattern. The gods who were not absorbed by the new system were classified as enemies, and those who were absorbed were reinterpreted in such a way that they became unrecognizable. The Black divinity was erased, whitewashed, renamed. The presence of the African sacred was diluted, hidden in symbols, incorporated into secondary figures, and above all, banished from collective memory. But even with so much effort to erase this spiritual heritage, the clues are still there. In legends, in cultural expressions, in popular rites, in syncretic cults, in ancient documents, in manuscripts forgotten in forbidden libraries, and especially in the hearts of those who feel that there is something wrong with the way spirituality has been presented to the world. They feel that a piece is missing from this puzzle, and that piece is black. And this isn't just about religion, it's about identity. When you erase a people's gods, you erase their worldview, their self-esteem, their connection to the invisible, to ancestry, to life, and to death. The erasure of black gods was also the erasure of divinity within black bodies themselves. That's why reclaiming these names, these stories, these symbols is a spiritual act. It's an act of reparation. Do you realize how deeply this resonates? Because perhaps, without realizing it, you've been carrying within you a spiritual guilt that isn't yours. Perhaps you've learned to reject symbols that actually belong to your soul. Perhaps you've been taught to fear that which in reality was part of your liberation. And now that these truths are coming to light, it's difficult to continue looking at the world in the same way. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you recognize that the gods were erased on purpose, you understand why your spiritual connection was severed and why it's so urgent to reconnect with it. Tell me in the comments, which name, which deity, which part of this spiritual erasure has touched you the most so far? Comment, I will reclaim my spirituality, if you feel this story is also yours. As we delve deeper into this spiritual investigation that invites us to reconsider everything we believe we know about faith, a new scenario begins to emerge, and it is much more intense and strategic than it seems at first glance. It wasn't just about different beliefs coexisting, but a true spiritual war between deities, an invisible yet profound clash between ancestral forces vying for the hearts, minds, and loyalty of ancient peoples. And at the center of this battlefield were powerful names that still resonate in our spirituality today: Yahweh, Baal, El, Moloch, and so many others who, at some point, occupied the throne of the sacred. The traditional narrative that many people know today presents Yahweh as the only true God, victorious over all others, a supreme being who destroys idolatry and establishes monotheistic faith as the legitimate path. But is that exactly how it all happened? Or are we facing an ancient dispute, retold and reorganized from a later perspective, a perspective that chose to exalt only one side of the story and transform the others into villains, false gods, or threats to the faith? The Bible, especially the Old Testament, is full of evidence of this spiritual warfare. The text constantly speaks of the need to destroy altars, eliminate idol poles, silence the prophets of Baal, prohibit sacrifices to Moloch, and tear down the images of Asherah. But why all this concern about eradicating other cults? The answer lies precisely in the fact that they were much stronger and more popular than one might imagine. The cult of Baal, for example, was not marginal. It was dominant in several regions of ancient Canaan. Baal was the god of fertility, rain, and abundance, worshipped by kings, priests, and entire families. His image was powerful, imposing, linked to life and the prosperity of the land. El, considered the father of the gods in the Canaanite pantheon, represented a figure of supreme authority, very similar to the later concept that would be attributed to Yahweh. In fact, there are ancient texts that show Yahweh as one of the sons of El, suggesting that in his origins, he was part of a polytheistic structure with a divine hierarchy, something that was carefully erased or reinterpreted in later versions of the scriptures. Moloch, however feared he may have been portrayed, was a deity associated with sacrifices and pacts, practiced by entire peoples with rituals that today would be considered unacceptable, but which, at that time, had a profound and structuring spiritual meaning. What becomes clear when studying these passages carefully is that these gods were not false due to a lack of power, but rather they were disruptive. They competed for space. They represented worldviews that could not coexist with the model that would be consolidated with the centralization of the cult of Yahweh. This spiritual war, in practice, was also a war of narratives. And this is where you need to open your mind to see what almost no one dares to say. Yahweh's victory over these other gods was not only spiritual, it was political. It was a strategy of national construction, of collective identity, of centralized power. Imagine a people in formation, still without a defined territory, amidst strong empires and established religious cultures. It was necessary to create a god who would unify, who would represent exclusivity, who would be jealous enough to prevent alliances with other cults. A god who, by becoming the only one, would also become the symbol of the sovereignty of an emerging nation. This explains why so many ancient biblical texts speak of the wrath of the Lord when the people worshipped other gods. It wasn't just a spiritual matter, it was a threat to the political and cultural unity that was being built. Every altar of Baal that remained standing, every Asherah ritual practiced in the mountains, every sacrifice to Moloch, was seen as an act of resistance to the project of spiritual domination centered on Yahweh, and this resistance needed to be eliminated. But think about it. If Yahweh was the only true God, why did he need to compete? Why were there so many warnings, threats, and punishments against those who worshipped other gods? The very existence of these commandments reveals that the faith of the peoples was much more plural, much more fluid, and that the imposition of monotheism was a process, not a starting point. The war between gods didn't just happen on a mystical level. It was waged in the decisions of kings, in the reforms of temples, in the editing of sacred texts, in political alliances, and in armed conflicts. There are times when the Bible mentions that Yahweh destroyed the gods of the other nations, or that he defeated the gods of Egypt during the Exodus. These descriptions, however symbolic they may be, clearly indicate that there was a spiritual struggle underway. But what you may never have heard is that many scholars believe these victories were rewritten, accounts after the events, as a way to reinforce the supremacy of a single cult. In other words, what has reached us may have been the account of the winning side, not necessarily the absolute truth. And this later bias is not an invention. It becomes evident when we compare the oldest versions of the texts with versions edited centuries later. The very name of God, for example, appears in different forms in ancient documents. Yahweh, El, Elohim, each associated with different regional traditions, which were later unified into a single discourse. Even passages that mention a council of gods were softened to make it seem that Yahweh was always the only one. But the truth lies in the details. It lies in the persistence of parallel rituals, in the memory of cults that resisted, in the popular traditions that kept the forbidden names alive. Can you feel the weight of this? Because it completely changes how we understand faith. It shows that spirituality wasn't delivered ready-made from heaven, but rather constructed, contested, and shaped. And that many of the gods who have been forgotten or demonized today may have been, in their time, as sacred as the God who is worshipped today in pulpits and churches. The question remains, are we really worshiping the most ancient God, or only the God who won the war? If you've made it this far, you've already realized that we're dealing with a much deeper story than official versions have allowed. And now I want to know from you, do you believe there was a real spiritual war between these deities? Do you think Yahweh's victory was spiritual, political, or both? Comment below. I see the war of the gods if this content is opening your eyes. If you've been following this journey so far, you've already realized that there's much more in the subtext of humanity's spiritual history than conventional books dare to tell. And as we move forward, something becomes increasingly evident. The presence of the black gods, so powerful and rooted in ancestral traditions, was not completely erased. On the contrary, it infiltrated, subtly, strategically, and almost imperceptibly, the structures of early Christianity itself. That's right. The faith that is now proclaimed as exclusively Western, white, and hierarchical has deep roots in African spirituality, roots that were carefully disguised, reinterpreted, and often absorbed without giving credit to their origins. Christianity was not born in isolation from the world. It emerged in a complex scenario, amidst an intersection of cultures, beliefs, and practices that intertwined in the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Southern Europe. And it was precisely in this environment of intense spiritual syncretism that various black traditions, especially those from Egypt, Nubia, and Ethiopia, found a direct passage into the new Christian faith. But of course, as in any process of cultural and religious domination, this entry was not openly celebrated. It was done in the Ba'in shadows, hidden under new names, modified symbols, and rewritten stories. Even so, the traces remain, and if you look closely, they are everywhere. Have you ever wondered, for example, why there are so many images of the Virgin Mary with African features or dark skin known as Black Marys? Is it a coincidence? Or is it a reflection of the continuity of a pre-existing cult of divine female figures from Africa, such as Isis, Mayat, or Aset, who represented the Sacred Mother, divine wisdom, fertility, and compassion? These goddesses were worshipped with devotion for millennia before the appearance of Mary, and their images, often with the child in her lap, were already circulating long before the birth of Jesus. The visual and symbolic similarity is impossible to ignore. The archetype of the Black Mother with sacred child was simply transferred to Mary and Jesus, creating a symbolic continuity that went unnoticed by most, but which is striking to those who know ancestral spirituality, and it doesn't stop there. In the early centuries of Christianity, Ethiopia played a crucial role in the expansion and consolidation of the new faith. The Kingdom of Aksum, an African power, was one of the first to adopt Christianity as its official religion, even before many European countries. And with this adoption came symbols, rituals, and forms of worship that bore the mark of African ancestry. Ethiopian saints, such as Saint Moses the Black, Saint Yared, and Saint Takla Haymanot, are figures venerated to this day in various African and Eastern Christian traditions. Many of them lived in deserts, caves, and mountains, in deep connection with the divine, performing miracles and manifesting spiritual powers that directly recall the ancient Black prophets of before the Christian era. The problem is that these names did not reach Western Christianity with the same force. They were silenced, minimized, or ignored, precisely because they carried the mark of the faith's Black origins. African spirituality, however, did not cease to exist within Christianity. It merely changed form. Many of the rituals we know today in churches, such as the use of holy water, incense, chants in unknown languages, spiritual trances, the laying on of hands, and liturgical dance, are practices that already existed in African religions long before the founding of the Christian Church. These practices were absorbed, disguised, and are now seen as part of the normal liturgy, without acknowledging their ancestral origins. Even Jesus himself was depicted for centuries with darker features in various regions of Africa and the Middle East. Early Christian icons portrayed Jesus and his disciples with dark skin, curly hair, linen clothing, and long tunics, more like African men than the blonde, blue-eyed figures that were later popularized in Europe. These representations were not merely aesthetic. They reflected the cultural and geographical reality of the environment in which Christianity was born. But with the advance of spiritual colonization, these images were whitewashed, adapted to the dominant European standard, and imposed on the world as the only possible version. Another powerful point is the symbolism of the Holy Spirit itself, described in the Bible as fire, wind, a powerful presence, supernatural manifestations, exactly the same elements used to describe African deities who act through oracles, dances, chants, and trance states. There are records that, in the first encounters between European missionaries and practitioners of African religions, many were impressed to see rituals reminiscent of passages from the Book of Acts, such as the descent of the Spirit at Pentecost. But instead of recognizing the connection, they preferred to label as demonic everything that did not fit into Western theology. And this leads us to the following question: what truly separates early Christianity from ancestral Black religions? Is what we have been taught as true faith actually a product of mixtures, adaptations, and syncretisms that no one recognizes anymore? By denying the African roots of Christianity, are we not also denying an essential part of our own soul? The truth is that Black spirituality never ceased to exist. It simply took on other forms to survive persecution, censorship, and attempts at erasure. And these forms are present to this day in many elements of Christianity, in popular festivals, in devotions to Black saints, in communities that pray fervently, in symbols that withstand the test of time. They are clues, marks, reminders of what was once open, visible, and celebrated, but which today needs to be rediscovered. If you feel that your faith has something deeper than what you've always been told, if you've already realized that there are hidden truths behind the walls of churches and sacred books, if you've ever looked at an image of a Black Madonna and felt something different vibrating within you, then you are already reconnecting with this ancestral energy. You are already touching, even without realizing it, the heart of a spirituality that spans millennia and that still pulsates. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever seen a Black representation of Mary, Jesus, or any saint? Did you know about Ethiopia's influence on early Christianity? Comment below. The root is African if you feel you are reclaiming a forgotten part of your faith. Continuing with everything we have revealed so far, we now enter one of the most sensitive, controversial, and at the same time fundamental points for understanding the great spiritual manipulation that marked the formation of religions as we know them today: the intentional concealment of the so-called forbidden books. And here, my brother and sister, We are not talking about fantastical tales, but about sacred, ancient, profound records that were deliberately removed from the official scriptures because they presented visions of the divine that jeopardized the narrative centered around Yahweh as the one and only true God. These hidden books spoke of celestial black entities, of different gods and angels, of spiritual knowledge that confronted the authority of the religious institution. They brought a wealth of revelations that, had they remained visible, would have completely changed the way we perceive the sacred. Among the most powerful and unsettling books is the Book of Enoch. Few people know, but it was highly respected and studied by many early Jewish and Christian communities. Enoch, Noah's great-grandfather, was said to have been taken to heaven while still alive, and there he received visions, instructions, and cosmic secrets directly from celestial entities. But most impactful, in this book we find detailed accounts of the fallen angels, called Watchers, beings who descended from heaven and had relations with human women, generating giant descendants, the so-called Nephilim. These entities taught humanity advanced knowledge, technologies, and occult sciences, and, according to the text, were punished for it. Now stop and think, if these beings were merely evil angels, as many churches try to preach, why was the knowledge they transmitted, such as healing, astrology, agriculture, metallurgy, and cosmology, so valued by ancient civilizations? And what if, instead of a rebellion, it was an act of spiritual liberation, a movement of celestial entities wishing to enlighten humanity with knowledge that the dominant divine system wanted to keep secret? Furthermore, why are these watchers described as having a grand, mysterious presence, often associated with dark tones, dense clouds, fire, and a black presence? All this leads us to question whether these beings might not, in fact, be the same dark deities that were erased, now reinterpreted as rebels by those who wanted to maintain a monopoly on truth. Another profoundly impactful book is the Book of Jubilees, which recounts the events of Genesis, but with details not found in conventional Bibles. In it, we find a strong emphasis on the role of angels and spiritual entities that act directly in the creation and destiny of humanity. The text reinforces the idea that there are many powers acting in the world, not all subordinate to Yahweh, and that there is a spiritual hierarchy far more complex than that which traditional theology allows us to recognize. What is most unsettling about the Book of Jubilees is the emphasis on spiritual plurality, on the existence of beings that do not fit into the idea of a single, centralized God, but that coexist, interfere, and manifest the divine will in multiple ways. And as if that weren't enough, we have the Gnostic texts, which flourished in the early centuries of Christianity and were later declared heretical. These writings reveal a bold and liberating spiritual vision. The God of the Old Testament was not the supreme God, but rather an inferior entity, often called the demiurge, who created the material world and oppressed humanity. For the Gnostics, the true God, the supreme source of light, is beyond all this, and it is through inner knowledge, gnosis, that human beings can reconnect with their divine essence. Now imagine what this would mean for the institutional church, which preached obedience, fear, and submission to the God of thunder and war. The idea that there is a God greater than Yahweh, that there are entities of light who were treated as demons, simply for challenging the celestial power structure, this was unacceptable. It is for these and other reasons that these books were excluded from the councils that defined the biblical canon. The religious elite of the time knew that if these texts were accepted by the people, spirituality would become free, questioning, and impossible to control. Ancestral spiritual knowledge, with its African connections, its black celestial entities, its rituals of power and freedom, would have resurfaced. And that was too dangerous for those who wished to maintain an obedient and submissive flock. The Church, especially in the first centuries after its institutionalization by the Roman Empire, worked diligently to conceal this knowledge. It ordered libraries burned, persecuted Gnostics, silenced mystics, and destroyed entire communities that freely worshiped the divine. But what they didn't count on was the power of spiritual memory. In remote places, in deserts, in caves, in oral traditions, passed down through generations, the forbidden books survived. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi texts are proof of this. These texts were hidden, protected from the world, waiting for the right time to reappear. And that time has come. Today, more and more people are awakening to the fact that there is much more between heaven and earth than official theology admits. The dark celestial entities described in these books were not forces of evil. They were masters, guides, guardians. They were beings who dared to challenge spiritual control to bring wisdom, empowerment, and true connection to humanity. And now, more than ever, it is our duty to bring these voices back, to name these presences, to restore their dignity, and to recover the pieces of spiritual history that have been hidden for so long. Do you feel it? That restlessness within you isn't doubt. It's awakening. It's your soul remembering what was erased, but not destroyed. And when you begin to connect the dots, everything changes. Because what seemed distant, forbidden, dangerous, is actually part of your origin, part of your deepest spiritual calling. And now that you know this, what will you do with this truth? Comment below. I want access to the forbidden books, if this part of the video awakened something dormant in you. As we advance on this journey to understand the true history of the black gods and the ancestral spirituality that preceded Yahweh, we arrive at a point that is visual, powerful, and almost palpable: the ancient images of these deities. These representations are not mere artistic figures. They carry the essence of a time when divinity was seen, felt, and celebrated in a concrete way, deeply connected to the daily lives of African peoples. Each statue, each engraving, each inscription was a channel of communication with the sacred, a link between the human and the divine, a way to manifest the power and spiritual presence of these entities that shaped entire cultures. Looking at these images is looking at a history that, even today, tries to resurface from the shadows of oblivion. Statues of gods such as Amun-Ra, Ptah, Olodumare, and other African deities depict figures with dark skin, penetrating eyes, and postures that emanate authority and supernatural presence. Many are represented on thrones, holding scepters or orbs, symbols of spiritual dominion and connection to the heavens. In some inscriptions, serpents coil around bodies or pillars, representing energy, wisdom, and transformation, essential elements for life and creation according to the African worldview. Every detail, every proportion, every ornament carried meaning. It was not just art, but a spiritual language, and these images were widely recognized, revered, and used in temples, palaces, places of worship, and public ceremonies. They served as landmarks, points of power, true energy centers that guided the people, protected the cities, and connected society to the cosmic order. However, as new religions began to consolidate and expand their influence, a systematic process of visual and cultural replacement began to unfold. Black deities, once openly celebrated, began to disappear from temples and streets, and their images were gradually replaced by Eurocentric figures. The issue here is not merely aesthetic, but political and spiritual. By imposing white, Eurocentric images of saints, Jesus, and even reinterpreted gods, religious institutions were reprogramming the perception of the divine to fit a specific cultural pattern aligned with European supremacy. This visual replacement was not neutral. It had a profound effect on how humanity came to view spirituality, power, and the very identity of the sacred. If you look closely, you will see that ancient engravings, often on papyrus, temples, or monuments, depict black deities with symbols of authority: scepters, thrones, serpents, solar discs, lions, and birds of prey. These symbols were not decorative. They represented power, wisdom, protection, and connection to the cosmos. They taught the population that the divine was accessible, that it could be celebrated in life, that it possessed visible and comprehensible forms. In contrast, later Eurocentric images reduce the complexity of these figures, simplify their expressions of power, and, in many cases, whitewash their features to alienate people from the black ancestry that was at the heart of these traditions. This substitution was a true cultural and spiritual erasure, because by changing the appearance of the divine, the narrative about who had the right to power, faith, and spiritual heritage also changed. What is even more impressive is realizing that, despite all efforts to erase these representations, traces have persisted. Archaeological excavations in Egypt, Nubia, Ethiopia, and other African regions reveal sculptures, stelae, and inscriptions showing black gods in their original forms, often accompanied by hieroglyphs, sacred inscriptions, or records of ceremonies that confirm their importance in the daily and spiritual life of the population. In these vestiges, we see that the gods were not mere symbols of worship, but real entities in the collective mind, holders of power that inspired respect, fear, and devotion. They were deities who governed nature, fertility, the destiny of peoples, and the spiritual order, and their presence in the images reinforced the connection between humanity and the sacred. And it is precisely at this point that we perceive the profound impact of visual erasure. When the figures were replaced by white European images, not only was the visual identity altered, but the very spiritual connection was severed. The spirituality of the peoples, which previously recognized itself in the features, colors, and symbols of their gods, began to be taught through alien, distant, and often incomprehensible models. People continued to believe, but faith now had fewer roots in what was ancestral and more in what was imposed. And this visual and symbolic alienation helped consolidate a spiritual monopoly, keeping power in the hands of those who controlled images, temples, and texts. But what is most fascinating is realizing that, even after centuries of attempts at erasure, these images still speak. They remain in archaeological artifacts, in museums, in forgotten temples, in popular traditions passed down through generations, and in certain secret rituals that have kept alive the memory of the black gods. They remind us that ancestral spirituality has not disappeared. It has only been displaced, masked, and reinterpreted. Each look at these sculptures, each detail of an ancient engraving, is an invitation to reconnect with the origin, to question what has been presented to us as absolute truth, and to recover what was taken from us, but which was never completely lost. Now I want you to reflect. Have you noticed how the images you know from the Bible or of European saints bear no resemblance to the gods described in African traditions? Have you ever wondered why the black ancestry of the divine has been hidden through art, sculptures, and engravings? Comment below. I want to see the black gods, if you feel that this history deserves to be known and reclaimed. As we move forward on this journey, we begin to encounter a question that challenges all the spiritual conventions we have been taught and that many are still afraid to ask aloud. What if God is also black? What if the true God, the one who existed before Yahweh, before the centralizing narratives, before the imposition of institutional monotheism, had been recognized, venerated, and represented with African features? This is not merely an aesthetic or symbolic question. It is a question of identity, of spiritual power, and of a profound understanding of what the connection between the human and the divine means. When we imagine this possibility, everything we believe about the history of spirituality and about religion itself is placed in a completely new light, and this provokes a reflection that goes far beyond what we might consider traditional or comfortable. If we accept the hypothesis that God, in his primordial essence, was black, we immediately encounter profound and multifaceted impacts. First, the spiritual impact. By recognizing that the divine has African traits, that the light, wisdom, and justice emanating from the Creator also come. From this ancestry, we can begin to recover the spiritual connection lost for millennia. This is not just a reconnection with the sacred, but a reconnection with our own essence, with that which spiritual colonization tried to erase, minimizing, distorting, and reinterpreting the presence of black people in divine history. It is recognizing that the spirituality of black people has always been at the center of the universe, even when official texts, images, and traditions tried to convince the world otherwise. The social impact of this reflection is also profound. Imagine a world where black people recognize, through history and spirituality, that they carry within themselves traces of divinity, that this ancestry is not secondary, submissive, or marginalized, but central, original, and sacred. This breaks centuries of oppression, Eurocentric narratives, and cultural devaluation. We begin to see not only historical figures and spiritual heroes as symbols, but as real manifestations of a direct connection with the divine, something that traditional religious education has often erased. This recognition also transforms collective and individual self-esteem, strengthens identities, and provides a new perspective on spiritual and personal power. It is a profound awakening that challenges the prejudices, dogmas, and distorted stories that have been told to us. From a theological standpoint, the hypothesis of a black god radically alters the narrative. Contemporary African theologians, such as John M. Beatty, have already emphasized that the African understanding of the sacred is integrated, multidimensional, and deeply connected to the people, nature, and ancestry. They argue that by centering the divine on distant, white, and ethnocentric representations, the Christian and Jewish traditions have lost some of their transformative potential. Mbiti and other African scholars affirm that recognizing God as black is not an act of provocation, but rather of historical and theological justice. It is to perceive that the representation of the divine cannot be dissociated from the reality of the peoples who first venerated it, nor from the spiritual practices that have kept it alive throughout the centuries. This vision opens doors to an inclusive theology that embraces African ancestry and recognizes that the sacred has always been present everywhere, even when institutional religions have tried to hide it. The connection to the spiritual identity of black people today is even more evident. For centuries, black spirituality was marginalized, associated with superstition or paganism, while the dominant narrative exalted distant white figures. But reflecting on the fact that God can also be black, that he was venerated as such before Yahweh became the central name of monotheistic faith, opens a space for reclaiming ancestry, spiritual empowerment, and reconnection with practices, symbols, and rituals that have resisted time and repression. Black people begin to see their spiritual history not as fragmented, suppressed, or secondary, but as origin, root, and source of power, understanding that each ancestor, each preserved ritual, each song, and each story is a reflection of the divinity that also carries African traits. When we meditate on this possibility, we also realize that the issue is not merely historical or symbolic. It is alive, urgent, and has a direct effect on everyday spirituality. To think of God as black is to affirm that the light of the Creator has always been close to African peoples, that divine revelation is not exclusive to one culture or one color, and that ancestral wisdom can finally be recognized and celebrated without fear. And if this makes you question everything you've learned about religion, I invite you to reflect deeply. How many elements of the faith we follow today have been reinterpreted, erased, or distorted so that black ancestry would remain invisible? How many symbols, practices, and stories that reach us seem incomplete or disconnected simply because their origin has been censored? Throughout history, many missionaries, theologians, and spiritual leaders have attempted to erase or diminish the black presence in the sacred. But as we have seen so far, the truth has never completely disappeared. It resides in ancient representations, forbidden books, oral traditions, and practices that have secretly survived, sometimes transformed, sometimes reinterpreted. Recognizing that God can also be black is to reconnect with this invisible current of power, resistance, and spirituality that spans millennia. It is to allow black ancestry to become visible, not only in history or archaeology, but in the very faith lived and celebrated today. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever considered the possibility that God is also black? That the history of the divine before Yahweh has African roots? Comment below. Black God exists. If you feel this reflection has stirred something within you. If you've made it this far, congratulations. This shows that you are truly interested in discovering the hidden truth about black gods and the ancestral spirituality that came before Yahweh. Now I want you to be an active part of this journey. Subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss any profound content like this. Leave your like to show that you made it to the end, and comment below with the words, "I want the truth," if you also want to continue uncovering these stories that have been hidden for millennia. And it doesn't stop there. The next video is appearing on the screen, and it will take you even deeper into this mystery, revealing secrets that few have had access to. Click on it. Continue this journey and discover how ancestral black spirituality still influences the world today.